Vin, are you ready to tell us what you're building and get some feedback?
I'm the founder of Botley Bio.
ClearOps answers hard questions about privacy and security.
I'm building Sugar, which is a gamified recommendation platform.
But this is your job.
Why is he on stage?
What's Up is a full-service software solution that monitors EV chargers.
The difference is everything.
I like that pitch.
Hey there, and welcome to episode 16 of The Feedback Loop, the show where every week startup founders get up on stage in front of a live audience in New York City and then give the 1-minute pitch for their startup and their vision of the future. And then they receive unfiltered feedback from two real investors about both their concept and their storytelling, all with the goal of helping push them forward in their startup journey. Each founder gets 1 minute to give their pitch, no slides, no deck, no demos. It's just the essence of the story. Then it's 5 to 10 minutes of questions and feedback, alongside some game-changing advice about how they can give that pitch moving forward to better sell their product or service, recruit team members, and raise venture capital. With that in mind, this is the second half of a particular session we recorded with my guest host for the night, investor and venture capitalist Matt Kaliski, who is a principal at Acronym Venture Capital. He is also the founder of FirstGen, which is dedicated to providing immigrant and first-generation founders with the type of support they need to succeed in the venture and startup ecosystem. With that, let's jump right into the next pitch. Round of applause. Next founder up. What's your name?
My name's Hillary Taylor.
Hillary, are you ready to tell us what you're building and receive some feedback?
I am.
You have a minute. What are you building?
The number one obstacle to electric vehicle adoption is low charger downtime. At What's Up, we're addressing this obstacle with our predictive maintenance software solution for charging site operators and charging hardware manufacturers. Today, these companies lack the tools and resources needed to ensure high charger uptime. And this has resulted in 1/3 of electric vehicles being non-functional at any given time. What's Up is a full-service software solution that monitors EV chargers, gathers and analyzes real-time performance data, and predicts failure. Upon prediction of the failure, we connect our customer with skilled and certified technicians to fix it. We are a team of hardware and software engineers with a combined 25 years building and selling EV charging solutions. We're going after a $1 billion...
That's a minute.
Great job. I think that was very comprehensive.
That was very good. What's the... there's an EV charging startup. Name them so that I remember which one I'm thinking of.
Electric Fish. There's
Charge
so many.
Point.
It's not a startup.
Oh, it's a big company, right? Is it Legacy?
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So I know someone who was a senior engineering leader at ChargePoint, was a client. So I learned a lot about this space. In fact, his role as an engineering leader. So I have like a lot of sympathy for this. Funnily enough, I think that's probably made me a little bit infected. His entire role was analytics because of failure rates and because of like the network of ChargePoint stations and all this other stuff being very complicated, hard to keep up, hard to maintain. That was, as a senior engineering leader, he built a platform for them just to deal with it within their systems. So I'm very sympathetic to this. And I think you hit, for me, as someone who's heard this story even a little bit, I go, okay, yeah, all of that checks out. And I have questions as to like your specific solutions.
Right.
Shall we dig in more, or do you want to say anything first?
Well, I think the feedback was very good presentation, but you can slow down.
Okay.
I think it was a lot coming at me. Because there's a lot to be said. You can probably simplify it a little bit. But I also like understand that it's kind of hard to be on stage. So I'm sure that comes with practice. Yes. But just slowing down and just taking a breath, I think can give you a little bit more, what's the right word?
Pace.
Fair, yeah.
So let's dig in a little bit. You know, one of the things I'm immediately curious about, and we'll see if this is like something I want you to include in your pitch. So you're doing, kind of predictive maintenance on top of this. Does that mean you're essentially a marketplace where like you're generating the transaction through that predictive maintenance?
That's the goal. Sure.
Should you be SaaS instead and sell them just like the data of like, here's how your charging stations are doing, here's when to know you should call somebody? Because it sounds like you're handling that for them.
Yeah, that's a good question. So what we're finding, especially through a lot of customer discovery calls, is a big bottleneck is the charge site operator not even knowing there's a problem. We've had calls where we have them log on to their dashboard for the first time and they're like, oh my God, we have a 50% down rate on our chargers. So it's a bigger issue of, I think, just the charge site operators not being the fundamental expert user. And they're also not interested. You know, some charge site operators will have chargers at multifamily apartments and stuff. They're more interested in that. So if we can automate this, right, and remove them from the equation, we remove the bottleneck. And typically they're fine with that because they don't want to worry about it anyway.
Can you maybe talk to the structure of the ownership of the charging points? Like, is it the company that owns it, or is it like kind of like a gas station where you have like individual people that own that gas station, they just buy gas from?
Or in some cases, I guess a network that might own it?
It can happen both ways. So sometimes the charging manufacturer, and this is who we're actually piloting with later this year, sometimes they own and operate the hardware as well. Sometimes the charging manufacturer will sell the hardware, and that is owned and operated by a charge site operator. Those are the two distinctions.
Who are you targeting first then?
Both right now. We have had more traction with the hardware side because they want to differentiate themselves from the rest of the players in the field. And there's a lot of them being born right now, charging hardware startups.
So should you focus on that point then?
We are very young, but maybe this is the cue to focus. Yeah.
You had a stat there, 1/3 of EVs being non-operational. Did you mean charging stations or literal EVs?
Charging stations,
sorry.
Okay. Yep.
Because I was going to ask, wow, does the lack of charging stations
EV
being
chargers.
operational? You know, this is the interesting point that I think, you know, to Matt's question is, who has the incentive to most want to engage and also want to engage in your particular solution? And I do think actually, in addition to the pitch, you could use pace. The other thing it could use is probably context as to like why you think either of these markets could work. And I actually think there are successful early stage pitches that do say, hey, here are two things we're targeting, and here's why both could be interesting. Here's who we're going with first as an exploration of our market.
Well, let me ask you, what's your hypothesis about the company?
About the company?
Yeah.
The hypothesis is that traditional workflows with EV charging maintenance are way too manual and reactive.
I like that pitch.
The one-liners are coming later in these cases. Well, it does bring me to something, which is like, do the chargers get more sophisticated? Do the operations around these things get so sophisticated that you become, maybe you're relevant for a few years, but then you become, for a good reason in terms of charging manufacturers, irrelevant when these become more reliable or they come with their own kind of maintenance tooling?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Maybe I'm biased because I come from 10 years of actually building the charger. They're very reliable when they launch, but they require a certain knowledge from the site operator around preventative maintenance and upkeep. So I think that this is going to be because they are very complex, especially when it comes to a DC fast charger. It's a very complex piece of hardware. Did you realize
you had built these for 10 years, by the way?
No.
Did you say that in your initial pitch?
I said 25 years combined building and selling.
I don't like those like combined team stats because they always make like 70 years doing this. I think you saying you have done it for 10 years is like way better than that. That like you can feel it, right? Like that brought me to a lot of credibility as to like you saying this is a problem and is a real problem that'll last.
But I think like what you two are talking about is like, you know, you might in a conversation you might think that these chargers are just so sophisticated they would work, and they do. They're great. But it's not about them. It's about the people that operate them.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And I think that's kind of how you drive the point home.
Yeah.
Like the point you made that they're worried about something else in a multifamily is a great point.
And now that I think about it, like your initial pitch felt like you were reading a paragraph over your website.
Okay. Fair.
And I think this, like when we're having a conversation and you can drive the point home about your experience, how sophisticated yet unreliable these are, I think can make it much more tangible. Because like now I'm like, oh yeah, like I remember like even when you go to a gas station to fill up a car, like how often those pumps don't work. Right?
But it's making me only want that side of the business. I know you're saying you're having like this early test with a manufacturer, and obviously you come from that space, so you probably have credibility in that space. But now that we're talking about this, the visceral and emotional and sticky part of this problem feels like it's with the operators who are not the manufacturers.
It's true.
And it makes me want you to focus entirely on them. And this is the hard part when it's a business like this. I'm just going to like tell it to you as you know it, right? Because you probably feel this every day. That question I asked you of, is this a problem forever? that's the thing you almost want to wrestle with, and it can compete with your early product market fit. So your early product market fit might be with these manufacturers who are giving you access and money and saying, yeah, we want a deal because this makes sense for us. But your true product market fit in that longer term, the vision of the company longer term might be to say, I believe that charge point operators will continue to exist. These will not always be owned and will most of the time not be owned by manufacturers. And all of these people have other incentives, therefore will be distracted. I will always have a customer.
Yeah.
And that feels like a reasonable thesis.
But that goes back to like one of the earlier conversations, like what's the vision of the world that you have, right? And like, how can we see what that is?
Yeah, if you tell that story, I think that would be like a great way to start the conversation.
Okay.
Good job.
Thank you.
Overall,
Thank you.
I'm just not confident that these chargers will always have this sort of a setup. And I'm worried about startups that rely on other people's platforms like this in ways that feel like they're inevitable to change. In other words, I feel like manufacturers are incentivized to make these chargers better, to make them easier to use, to make charge point operators have easier times using them. And so my worry is less about the pitch and how the narrative of the pitch is being constructed, and more so, I think this business has a lot of platform risk.
That's okay. So you might not be the right investor for it.
Yeah. And this is where someone, has, I think, the right background on this, who deals in EVs, could have a very different point of view.
But I do think we learn much more through the conversation. I think there's a lot that can be repackaged into that initial pitch to help people be like, hey, I want to dive into this more, or I don't believe in this.
Platform risk is hard. And that's the thing that I also should say, right? Like when founders think about if they have that platform risk, that's not avoidable at the end of the day.
But manageable.
Manageable, for sure. For sure. Next founder up. Round of applause.
I feel like I'm on like the Between the Ferns set, but without the ferns.
Said that, yeah.
This is beautiful. Thank you for letting me do this.
If only we were as funny. That's the...
I'll try.
We've got the antler sweater. I'm excited to hear if that's part of the pitch too, but do you have a minute? Are you ready to tell us what you're building?
Yeah, of course. My name's Christopher Patel. I'm the founder of Motley Bio, where we're building multi-omic technologies for disease profiling and detection. Second-time founder, first company was acquired for $100 million in January. And to describe what multi-omics is and like why biotech is interesting, what we're doing at Motley is essentially what OpenAI is doing in the context of training data on fundamental units of information, video, text, and audio. In that same line, at Motley Bio, we are training and generating data from patients on the fundamental units of biology and honestly life, DNA, RNA, and proteins. And why is that interesting? Because the last 20 years to 30 years, we've been looking through a very small people to understand disease. That's why you only have less than 5 hallmark therapies in oncology and cancer. And by widening your understanding or deepening your understanding of disease with technologies at Motley Bio, you can not only develop better diagnostics, you can also develop better drugs. In terms of progress, first check, partnership with one of the best cancer centers in the world that may or may not be in the city, and a couple other things I'm happy to talk about.
All right, good job.
Thoughts?
I think it's going to get far more interesting as we talk. I think the analogy didn't hit for me, like the OpenAI audio video thing, because I think what that analogy is trying to do is it's trying to teach me what you think the arbitrage is. But I think talking about that arbitrage, and we'll get into it, but like talking about that arbitrage more directly would have been helpful, because it's like, so I did a lot of work after hearing your pitch in my head of going like, okay, what are the ingredients we're really talking about here? What biomarkers? What does DNA mean in this case? And so like my brain had to do some of that fill in of what the analogy was attempting to do.
I'm gonna have a divergence here. I thought that was actually a very good pitch. I think it told a very good story, just from how you were able to tell your own kind of personal story and be able to kind of show what's possible through the technology. Even though I'm not a bio investor, like I don't really get it, but I think it was like an interesting like personal story. I think you're able to talk about what you're doing and kind of what that might be able to enable, and what some of the blockers have been and continue to be. So like I thought I kind of hit on like a lot of the things that you would see in a deck, but very succinctly and very clearly.
I do think, by the way, you have a command of your pitch, right? Whether I like the pitch or not is a different story.
Well, I think that's the difference, right?
It
It's
is a
like,
big difference because I think like you're delivering it in a way that like is legible, right? So now let's get into like the weeds of it. So let's start with that analogy thing because like my first curiosity after you gave your pitch was like, okay, what's really going on behind the scenes? So when you're training on this data, what are the things that you get to understand differently than what we do traditionally in, let's say, oncology?
Yeah, let's focus on oncology. So if you look at the landscape of clinical diagnostics in oncology, they mainly focus on one type of biomarker, DNA. And while that's very useful, there's multiple layers of information in a cell, in a cancer tumor, in a patient's body that can allow you to detect cancer earlier to improve a patient's outcome for survival. So to do that, you need to start building technologies like we are doing at Motley to incorporate other layers of information. So in this case, DNA, RNA, and proteins. So what we're doing is basically expanding your feature space. Like if you're familiar with the
machine learning model, yeah,
exactly. So we're expanding our biological feature space.
So feature being like a thing that you're using as a part of measurement.
Yeah, exactly.
But what like name one of those? I know we're not going to understand it maybe that well, but like name one of those things that will be let's call it an actionable difference. What's an actionable difference in terms of like when you're looking at more than just DNA?
So we're looking at DNA, RNA, and protein simultaneously.
Which gives you what though?
Well, what that gives you is higher to signal noise ratio.
What does it feel like either in a report that a doctor looks at or a patient looks at that might, but before and after, right? Before was Motley Bio, you said?
Yes.
So like the old version and the Motley Bio version.
Yeah. So essentially, like in terms of like specific features, mutations. Are you familiar with mutations?
Feel like I am, but I feel like
the basic parts of your DNA, when gone wrong, can lead to disease.
Right.
But there are other types of features in terms of RNA. If you're expressing a gene or RNA too often, that can lead to specific type of disease. If you're expressing a protein too much, like in Alzheimer's, there's a specific protein that if there's too much of it in your brain, you have a higher likelihood of getting Alzheimer's.
So why is this not part of, kind of modern practice today?
It's going to be. And the reason why, and this is kind of my biotech evangelist like plug, where we are in biotech is really, really, really exciting. And I bring it back to where we were in tech in the 70s and 80s, where personal computing really took off, which led to 3 huge markets that changed the world: computers, mobile, and the internet. And why? Because computing got very cheap. So flash forward to now, 2024, sequencing, which is technology that lets you learn more about what's happening in the human body, in late 1990s, took 10 years to sequence a single person and multiple billions of dollars. Now it takes less than $200 and multiple hours. So the rate at which the cost of sequencing and how long it takes to get the information from a human patient is exponentially getting lower, which allows you to really start characterizing at scale what's happening in a person.
And is that what you're doing?
Yeah. So what we're doing is essentially, now we're at a point where we can start delivering comprehensive analyses through this lens at an affordable price in medicine. Medicine is very sensitive to price when it comes to diagnostic tests.
What's the product today?
Yeah, so the product today, or what it will be, we just got our first check from Antler. We're currently pre-seed fundraising. It'll be a sequencing service. A customer, rather it be a biotech company, a pharmaceutical company, or a hospital, they send us a patient sample to our lab. We process it, and we send them back either raw data or our insights.
Were you fundraising for your previous startup? Or were you like working at a startup?
I was a founding scientist. So we built this technology out of Weill Cornell, and myself and 3 others left to start C2I.
Got it. So you qualified to be talking about what you're talking about.
I hope so.
Yeah. I would maybe like work that into your pitch, but like,
yeah, of course.
I'm not smart enough to understand what you're doing or the potential of it, unfortunately. Sure. But I do think that you do a very good job of like telling the story, and I think it's very clear what you're trying to do. Whether we agree with that, I don't know. But I think you're communicating what you want, what you're doing, and what you want to do very well.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
I think the reason I'm maybe not as enthusiastic yet, I'm very much a UX person. Yeah. And so I liked your latest thing of like telling me, okay, what it might look like for, let's say a biotech firm. I want to hear more about how you're doing what you're doing versus I think this is the difference between like a full-time venture investor and someone who angel invests occasionally. Mm-hmm. I'm experiencing this thing of he's loving your narrative. You're telling a grand story and a vision of the world. Yeah. And a lot of VCs will write a check off that. Mm-hmm. If I was writing bigger checks, I'd be like, okay, get that out of my face for a second. Let's dig into the product. I only want to see the user experience. And, that's been kind of even some of our questions of the past founders where you'll ask some of the narrative, like, where is this, in terms of your career, and you're asking about their credibility. Whereas I want to know more about like, what's the touch and feel of the thing. So we just have different reception.
But this is great though, because this is like how most investors are. There's different types of investors. And
I wonder,
my partner will ask you immediately, like, what's your accuracy rating or like something like that.
Yeah, because that's what I started to wonder. I didn't ask it directly because I was like, okay, am I being too picky? But like, I want to know what you imagine is the difference in a diagnostic for an actual patient. And maybe let's kind of close with that. Like, what's the difference in what you think in the next 2 years you'll be able to provide to someone versus what they're getting? How much quicker might they get to what diagnosis, or how much more accurate might it be compared to current methods?
Yeah, sensitivity. We can offer higher sensitivity relative to currently FDA-approved clinical diagnostics.
For
solid cancer tumor types. So solid tumor types. But like I mentioned before, DNA, RNA, and protein is fundamental to all life. So not just in oncology, but other disease contexts, this could also be applicable.
Good job.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.
I'm very much a UX person, right? And so like, I think this is the sort of grand vision where like, if it works, it sounds like it's going to change everything. But it's harder for somebody who's not in his space like me to understand the next 2 years.
Right. But what's the point of the pitch? The pitch is to get a meeting.
True.
Right. And I think that was a very good example of how you get a meeting to be able to tell what you're working on.
Here's a question. Is there a better way to also get me as they get you? And it's harder, I think, with this sort of what I'll call like thematic biotech pitch to get two types of investors in the same pitch, right? Like this is the sort of pitch where you probably do have, I actually don't recommend most people do this, but the subject matter investor versus the non-subject matter investor. A lot of founders actually shouldn't have two different pitches because you should have a pitch that actually works for both, that goes off of your strengths and starts from kind of the same place and ends in the same place. But this might be an area where actually there is two very different modalities to bring someone like me along, because I'm trying to imagine how to get both of us in this, and it's a little difficult.
I think that happens all the time where there are companies that I think are great that I share with my VC friends.
Yeah.
And they're like, what are you doing?
Yeah.
Right. So like,
I do think there is a sense to which though, even if someone doesn't want to invest in you, you can have a pitch that lands with them.
I don't know if I agree with that though.
Interesting. You're the type of person that if someone passes on a company and then makes an intro, you're going to judge that they didn't invest? No. Okay. No? You'll take the meeting?
I'll take the meeting.
That's the thing that I think, like, I would say, right? If I want to be convinced enough that for the people in my network who know about the space, I'm excited to make that intro.
That's a fair point.
Next founder up?
Yep.
All right. Round of applause. Next founder up. What's your name?
Vin.
Vin, are you ready to tell us what you're building?
Yes,
you got some feedback? You have a minute. What are you building?
A good recommendation is priceless. So finding a recommendation in New York for every mood, bars, parks, attractions, restaurants, is actually a constant struggle. Have you ever been overwhelmed by how many options are there on Google or Yelp? They all look good. They're all 4.5 stars. They're all well reviewed, but which one do I go to? I'm building Sugar, which is a gamified recommendation platform for Gen Z where users can share their best recommendations and get personalized recommendations based on their own. These places get upvoted and downvoted by other users. And then there's also a decision-making experience that helps you pick where you want to eat, drink, or play based on some filters that users can select. And then you can swipe right or left on the potential options. So crowdsource recommendations, personalized to you, gamified to help you choose a decision. And then that's for sure it hits a sweet spot.
Good job. Sugar hits the sweet spot. What do you think?
I think the pitch was good. I think I've just heard so many different flavors of this that it's I think
flavors,
it's a 3.
sugar, sweet spot.
Quick feedback. I think you started off very strong, and then towards the end you kind of fizzled out. Whereas there's like really no moment to kind of capture and close up your pitch. So you just kind of like left trailing at the end.
I actually don't mind a lot of the components you brought to the table, but you have what is referred to in the industry as like a tar pit idea.
100%.
And tar pit ideas, for those who don't know, is like the ideas, as you know, that are tried pretty often. It's typically things that young founders always have the same pain point, and so they'll always attempt these sorts of startups. And so there tends to be a graveyard of restaurant recommendation startups, fitness startups, to-do list startups. There are a bunch of others in the tar pit. And that doesn't mean the tar pit isn't valuable. That doesn't mean the tar pit doesn't have something worth pursuing. But it does mean whenever I hear a tar pit pitch, I need the person to like tackle the tar pittiness of the idea. I want to hear them acknowledge, how dense the other plays have been. There's one thing about your pitch that I think is probably the different thing. That's the gamification thing that you said. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about that in a sec. But if that's true, if that's the one thing that's different that you think is the way that you're going to wedge in with Gen Z and make this actually work for the first time, then that should be your entire pitch. Like if you have a tar pit thing with a difference, the difference is everything. Yeah.
I'm curious to know, like, why do you think all of the other companies that are trying this have failed in the past?
Consumer is hard. That's a given. I think it's a pretty difficult audience. So consumer ideas are hard to get to a lot of people. They lack the, let's say, database of maybe recommendations or people on the platform to make it useful, get that critical mass. I think I might be coming from a different angle. I have some competitive advantages that we can talk about later, but those are two of them.
So what is your competitive advantage in that case?
Yeah, so I would say that I started a consumer startup, which I exited for a small sum previously. So I have some experience there. We got 3,000 users in 3 days. I thought that was pretty impressive. It kept going. This was in college. Now I'm back. Second is I have a repository of data from 40,000 New Yorkers about their best recommendations across restaurants, bars, and hidden gems in the city. And I think that data can be visualized and really well used as sort of a consumer tool. So a lot of the ideas are consumer social. I think I'm going for more consumer utility, where there's a social aspect to it, but it's not the forefront of it. So you are not using it because your friends are on it, but you're using it because it fulfills a basic need for you, which is when you're out, where can I go that's near me that does these XYZ purposes and that fulfills my needs at that moment.
What's the gamification portion of this?
Gamification is we're basically helping users decide that last step. It's like last mile delivery. We're getting you from all the options. Let's say you have 10 options. When you go to Google or Yelp, which are, again, they look pretty similar. They're all well reviewed, 4.5 stars. We're getting you from there to the final one or two recommendations. So that's through pretty helpful filters, which are based on location, age, demographic. Again, this data is filtered on a lot of this stuff. So being able to filter on that will help narrow the recommendations to someone like you guys or I
don't know if
me.
that's gamification, right? Gamification is going to be something that's like an incentive itself.
Right.
So gamification would be saying, hey, we're going to like get people to tune our recommendation algorithm to be better than anyone else's because you're going to get streaks and points for like marking restaurants that we're going to feed you every day and in your feed and tell you, what to swipe left if you liked eating here, swipe right.
So that's also part of it, right? Swiping left and right to make it a more interactive experience to get to that final point.
I would say that's very different. Like gamification is very different than like what I think you described as just like user experience. Mm-hmm. So like think of gamification as being, because that's what I was intrigued by.
Yeah,
right?
I think it's more so narrowing and then gamification, which is swiping left and right. You're able to see the recommendations in a different visualization.
I'm sure that's gamification, because gamification is the incentive. Mm-hmm. So gamification is like, I'm going to make it a game to do this thing. Just because your thing is a little bit delightful or fun doesn't make it gamification. Again, like if you said, I don't know if this is true, but you might say something like, I don't think people leave enough reviews after they leave a restaurant, but I'm going to make it a game. And actually Foursquare did this. The mayor thing.
Right, exactly.
In Foursquare, like was
Foursquare
gamification.
Reinvented, yeah.
Yeah. But the portion about Foursquare that was gamification was just the concept of being the mayor. The idea of how sexy the UI was in that moment was irrelevant. The incentive was you get to be mayor.
Right.
So that's just like maybe clear up the language around what you're defining as gamification versus simply like trying to create delightful user experience.
Right.
So is it more like a Foursquare or is it more like a recommendation engine?
I would say like it's a blend of like, let's say the For You page combined with Foursquare. So Foursquare, I mean, I didn't really use it, so I don't have the best idea on it. But when I looked at it, it does have some.
Is it because you're too young? Are we now in a generation where like we're past
I think so.
using Foursquare as a generational divide?
No, but like I would say a For You page for recommendations. So there's different crowdsourced lists for different categories: restaurants, bars, nightclubs, coffee shops, whatever you're looking for, and then you're able to easily look through the options and find something that really resonates with you.
Now that I'm reflecting on it, I kind of like your approach. It's like, hey, I know 1,000 people tried this and I know they all failed, but here's what I think is different. And I would like prefer that pitch because I think it helps me to understand that you're more aware of everything that's been out there and like why it failed. And if we can have a conversation about like, oh, you pinpoint like this failed for that reason or failed for that reason, and you're thinking about doing this differently, I think that gets me more interested as an investor.
It's embracing the fact it's a tar pit idea, right?
Agreed.
And I tell this to people all the time in job search as well. If they have like a thing that's strong about them, but slightly on like a weak edge, like just really go for how your unique take on it is going to be, you know, kind of everything about why you're trying to win that conversation over, especially with investors. Investors hear this pitch. You know, it's not just that the tar pit exists. They hear constant ideas in this tar pit. The last bit I'll really leave you with is really deeply interrogate the notion of the differentiation here. Mm-hmm. This is more product feedback. As a founder, I'm going to talk founder to founder rather than like angel investor to founder. I worry that you're not out of the tar pit from a product perspective. Mm-hmm. Let me tell you why I think you're close. I think you think this element of delight is where people got it wrong before, or kind of the recommendations coming to you off the notion of the categorization. But this stuff, you need a data input edge. This is why when you said gamification, I imagined you were going to use gamification as some incentive to get better data than anybody else. But then when you started to describe your product, everything you described was about the user experience of like discovery and like how you will narrow down the options at the end. But that's not the hard part of these products, right? These products don't tend to struggle because of the output. They don't tend to struggle because the person looking for a thing needs to narrow things down. They tend to struggle because the output's just not good enough, because the data input isn't good enough, right? The amount of reviews is not good enough. The collaborative filtering model in the back end isn't good enough. You might be using LLMs a certain way, right? I think if any tar pit idea in the space of restaurant recommendations is going to win, it's going to be because there's a novel way to gain more than ever and better than ever information to fuel the recommendation itself.
Do you mind if I push back a little bit?
Yeah, go for it.
So with the more you recommend, the better the recommendations get for you. So there's an inherent viral loop that gets created that improves the quality of the data for the rest of the users that are on the platform.
Is that not true of existing products though, I guess?
I don't use anything, and I've looked, and
that might be my worry. Is like I think that feels like things that other products in this space probably already do.
Okay.
Your input data is the thing, right? So your initial recommendation to a user is going to be fueled not by their own reinforcement loop, but by some other piece of data. So I agree with you that you should have a reinforcement loop on that own user.
Correct.
That self-user should have a reinforcement loop. But before then and surrounding them should be a bunch of other inputs. And that's probably the hard part of these products, because otherwise it's really easy for a Yelp, a Foursquare, I don't know what else exists right now in this space, to do the self-referential loop. And LLMs aren't really that helpful in the self-referential loop, right? Like they're okay. It's the world that is the input to the initial recommendation. And I think that initial recommendation is the thing that needs to be more novel.
Okay. Would you say that you're able to find like word of mouth recommendations online in any capacity? Or I guess
I'm one of those people that now like can say TikTok.
TikTok is like how I'm seeing it, but it's like not centralized. It's like by one person, sort of like crowdsourcing. So by volume, people like the spot. People really resonate with the spot.
I use Google reviews and I use Yelp still.
Okay.
I don't like using Yelp because now they like want to paywall or put everything behind a login.
Right.
I will say like I'm not confident that my pain is that sharp. And in general, like I don't think we all are so desperate for like something so much better than what we have. But that's the tar pit, right? So I might be wrong because all of us look at the tar pit and go, is it tar pitty enough?
Right.
And again, like a lot of these founders who have pitched today, a lot of the problems that we're going to have listening to the pitch are unavoidable. The fact you have a tar pit startup doesn't mean it's a bad startup idea. It just means like you have so much of this challenge that you're stuck in.
So many people have failed at the same spot.
Exactly.
Right.
Good luck.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But every year there's a fresh new batch of McKinsey grads and bankers that are looking for hotspots.
That's
and they're
true.
always looking to angel invest in ideas that can resonate with. So there's always an opportunity to raise.
And I will say, by the way, on that note, getting an initial target market, I thought that's where you're going, and trying to like anchor a target idea fixer. I'll say a lot of target ideas can do really well by deciding, let me fix a very tiny corner of the market. So maybe if you first a very small niche, So if this can win over McKinsey, I don't know, McKinsey guys or whatever it is, like some sort of use case, or oh man, Flatiron, lunch in Flatiron is really weird. It's either fast food or like a really expensive restaurant. That could be like an interesting, like if you could solve that, and you might not have scale to that solution, by the way, that just might be your beachhead to saying, from a product perspective, I can solve this problem. And if you prove that, then you can prove a lot to either investors or users as to, hey, I have something novel as to the recommendation engine that I built. So maybe consider like slivering down to get something working at a micro level and go from there.
Yeah. Awesome.
All
Thank you guys for the feedback.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
Thank you. Target ideas are so hard.
So hard.
Have
you ever invested in one?
Yes.
Which one?
I don't want to say because the founder is probably someone who watches this. I mean, it's in the job space.
Okay.
Their solution was not common. So I will say it wasn't tar pit from like they did have like a slightly novel solution, but it's a crowded space. That's the challenge. It's not that you might not come up with a slightly novel approach. It's that is that approach strong enough to allow you to rise out of the tar pit. How about you? Have you invested in tar pits?
What was that phrase? Solo-co. Yeah, whatever.
Social, local.
Like the first season of Silicon Valley. Good to rewatch it. Yeah. No, I think everyone was kind of investing in those ideas, and it's like
Sam Altman was on stage pitching. What was it called? Looped.
Yep.
With his double popped collars. It was the classic solo co-mo whatever.
Listen, it's a great training spot for entrepreneurs.
Right? I will say, if you can even fail in that sort of area where it's just so tough to compete, you're right. What a training spot.
What a training spot.
All right, next founder up. Round of applause. It's a co-founder pair. All right, what are your names?
I'm Caroline McCaffrey, CEO and co-founder.
I'm George Rosenbaum. I'm co-founder and CTO.
Awesome. George, Caroline, are you ready to tell us what you're building and receive some feedback?
Ready.
You have a minute. What are you building?
ClearOps answers hard questions about privacy and security. So I'm an attorney, and I have helped dozens of startups, companies, B2B companies, close hundreds of deals. And one of the things about closing deals is there's a lot of friction at the very end that drives the account executives crazy. It's a lot of legal and privacy and security compliance that the account executive has to go through. In fact, one time I was sitting in a board meeting and the head of sales was being asked why he didn't meet quota, and he said it's because all of these deals are blocked by legal. And so ClearOps solves that pain point. We help account executives, privacy and security compliance folks respond to RFPs, security questionnaires, privacy impact assessments, anything on that side of privacy and cybersecurity to get the deal and the sales closed faster. We do have an application in market, and we have seen a 250% increase in usage since January. And that's it.
Good job.
Wonderful. What do you think?
I think clear problem, clear-ish solution. There's some things I didn't want to hear that were added that can be easily removed. For example, 250% growth since January off of I have no idea what base is not an interesting metric. And I think a lot of founders should get rid of like the abstract metrics in a vacuum sort of thing. I have a lot of questions, but most of them are not because the pitch was unclear. It's mostly about the market and the product that you guys are building.
It's a good statement of what you're working on. I think you were able to bring your own personal story in, which is what I like to hear, right? Because again, it gives me confidence that you know what you're doing with like a unique insight that again, other people can't easily replicate. I think it was good to hear how you were able to tie a specific problem that you were trying to solve for in like a way that I can understand. It's like, hey, my head of sales is not closing deals. It's because it's stuck in legal, right? And we have that.
So clear.
Right. So like it gets pushed and it like hurts numbers. Like I get that. Like as an investor, I get that. Like, well, my company should be using this, right? So it just resonated personally with me because you were able to tell that story. There's definitely a lot of questions about, how it works, how do you deploy it, like all that kind of stuff. But I thought the presentation and the pitch was quite good.
Let's dive right into the questions. I'm going to ask the stickiest or not one up front. So it's Gen AI based, so it's LLM based, right?
Yes.
Why won't the foundational models be good enough at some point to integrate into every business's backend in a way that allows GPT-5, GPT-6, or Claude 3.5 with its new artifact system, et cetera, to kind of handle this on their own?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you're talking about the application layer, there's a lot of parts to it that are more than just that technology, right? So what we have built is a collaboration platform where all the stakeholders can work together and answering these questions that come from customers. And in addition, we have other services that sort of surround this whole process because what we're really talking about is risk mitigation and liability. And you can't, these foundational models aren't going to actually have these workflows that are specific to this particular pain point like that.
Great answer. Almost amazing. But I will say no one else. I mean, we have now done, this will be like the 11th session of the feedback loop. And we have a lot of founders who are, I don't mean this derogatory way, but are Gen AI wrappers of some kind, LLM wrappers of some kind. I'll ask that question. And for some reason, I can't get people to say this, right? It's the application layer where we bring in team management, access control. There's risk. And so you need a lot of containment around these things. Yes, eventually these foundational models might be good enough, and maybe OpenAI and Anthropic want to build application layers that are pretty robust. But for a user, a business that is concerned about risk, about compliance, about longevity of the data, about X, Y, Z, they're still never going to compromise on these aspects. And so we will always sell a SaaS, updating the foundational model along the way in our back end. Again, the excellent version, I think, does a little bit more specificity. So I'd love to hear, like you say, well, the people who are invited are legal compliance in this way. And they're always going to want to live in a collaborative workspace where there's access control per user. And this access control per user allows legal to see the deal as it's going through the sales pipeline. It allows people on the engineering side to be plugged in only as needed to answer specific technical questions. If you give me that would have just taken it to that next level. Again, you did a great job answering that, but take that to the next level, because then I go, yeah, I don't need to be worried about this whole foundational model thing. They've got something so specific that unless truly, let's say GPT-7 is so good at developing its own application layer for us, then we're all out of business. And venture is like 3 players. But other than that, you have a specific enough answer. So good job.
Thank you.
When does a company start using this? Is it typically at the end of the sales cycle? I'm just kind of understanding, like, if you're trying to onboard new customers, when do they get plugged into your solution?
Yeah, usually they come to us with the pain point when they're having it, and they want to know how fast can I implement, and I tell them you can do it in 10 minutes. It really is that fast because we use RAG. So you can pull in your policies or any other documentation that you have, and it'll immediately answer those questions based off of the sources that you've given it. So it's an immediate implementation, and it usually is at that pain point when they've had at least a couple of assessments or questionnaires from customers come in that have really slowed down sales, and they're just frustrated by having to answer the same question slightly differently asked every single time.
So another question, I feel like legal is getting such a beating from all of the Gen AI companies. It's crazy. And there's a lot of people that are trying to do something around your space, but I'm curious, what do you think other people are getting wrong about trying to solve this problem?
I think what people are doing wrong, a couple of things, I guess I would say is one, it's always this, and I understand this is Gen AI's value prop, but it's this race to what is the most quick, efficient, fast versus what is the most accurate and going to create the least amount of liability for your company. A lot of people, when you're faced with a questionnaire or an assessment, you think it's faster for me to answer it off the top of my head. I don't want to upload this thing. I don't want to spend time in an application. But what you're missing there is the consistency of your answers and the fact that you actually have a record now of what you have given to a customer that is contract, that is, if you breach, you are now subject to liability. So that's what I think is. It's just I understand the efficiency play.
How do you achieve that? Because my next question is going to be about RAG being a reliable solution, and whether or not it is, or whether or not it's expansive enough. So when we talk about being that reliable for a user who has to answer, let's say, a questionnaire, talk about that. How do we know we're in the right place?
Yeah, so we have a strong commitment to transparency. So everything that you put in, I think what you just said before about garbage in, garbage out, you see everything that's in the platform. You can change it any time. That's really super important. But also when you're dealing with it's an auto answer feature, right? So when you look at the auto answer, you're obviously worried about hallucinations. You're worried about the accuracy from the RAG document. So being able to search through those sources on the same page, talking about UI, which you said you have a strong interest in, being able to see where the AI got its sources from. So it's citing the exact places from the sources that you told it to for the RAG purposes. It's also about seeing who answered or who evaluated that answer. So having the user's comments and additions tracked. All these things go to the reliability of the system.
There's an approval loop.
Exactly.
That's really interesting.
The term we've used is a system of record, because you could have whole lots of data on the system. You could be filling out questionnaires, assessments, RFPs, and so on. But at the end of the day, you need to see where the citations are from. You need the hard evidence. It's good to have the processes that we have, and that's a big part of what we do. You have the structure. Who signs off on what? Who's approving this vendor? Who's responsible ultimately for what happened when? That's great. But ultimately, you also need the evidence to go back to and go, why was this decision made? Is this magic? So anybody could actually look at it, junior, senior person, and go, oh, we answered that we have a SOC 2 because here's the citation. It's not Amazon's SOC 2. It's not someone else's SOC 2. It's our SOC 2. And here's the details.
I don't know if it's related to just like, as you're talking, one of the things I'm realizing that should be thematic as part of your story. This is all going to become more complicated because of Gen AI as like a usage-based thing, or B2B engagements with each other, and our agreements as to how you're going to use my data and how complicated that gets for an end user who's liable. And that should be part of your pitch, is like, this isn't just the questionnaires we've been getting for the past 5 to 10 years. This isn't just SOC 2, GDPR, whatever else. This is going to be on another level moving forward. And our obligations to each other and the record of our obligations to each other are going to be more sensitive. For deals to get done in 5 years are going to require more lawyers or AI lawyers, not less, right? And like, that should be part of your pitch, because ultimately, you've answered all the micro really well, but I still have to believe in a theme. And that's the theme that would get me to go, well, what was it called again?
ClearOps.
ClearOps is like there for the future version of this problem, not just for the present.
Yeah, you have such a front row seat to seeing what this is, what's happening and what you think will happen. Help us understand that, right? And I think just like that story that you said about like the head of sales in that boardroom, what is that for like where we're going to be like in 5 years, right? Because I totally agree with you. I think it's actually going to might be counterintuitive, but we might have like more software to manage software and more people to manage all of this. So like
risk surface area up.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a good way. Is like, you're a lawyer as a professional risk manager, right? Like, help us understand how the risk profile and the risk surface area is changing, and how you're building a solution to help companies actually control it. Because that I can buy.
So should I talk about the number of laws that are going into effect, and even how the EU AI Act is now requiring additional AI assessments, and how it's just like there's just more and more and more?
Whatever complexity that you can speak to that will make it even that much more difficult, I think that should be part of it, right? Because everyone thinks that like AI is simplifying operations, but it sounds like it's the opposite, right? But that's not what everyone seems to believe now, right? So you have to let us know and help us understand.
Well, and then there's the whole idea of like the enterprises that want it to simplify their operations, but this is the barrier from allowing them to. And we've seen that, right? There are two things that all of these companies will say themselves when they're out in public talking about why adoption is so limited in the enterprise. The two things they say is, one is it's hard for everybody to learn inside the enterprise how to actually use these tools and put them into daily practice inside their work. And two is all of these issues around security, privacy, compliance. So, you're falling into broader theme. This isn't about you, Georgia. I like you. Why is he on stage? I'm asking you that question.
Because I like to have the privacy and the security emphasis that we have as a company also on stage.
I am a big believer in not bringing two to the initial pitch in almost any circumstance. I'd say it does three things that don't serve the startup. The first is there's the dynamic of, okay, what wound up happening by the time we stopped talking? So you had one answer and you had all the other answers. And you don't control that because you don't know where the conversation's going. And you seem competent enough to handle the questions you would let him handle in an optimal scenario, right? It still might be optimal, but you seem competent enough. You don't need that in the first meeting. The second component is it starts to be this like, I want now the CTO style evidence because he's here, right? So now you've created this, well, if he's going to be here, he better say something, right? And so now you've created an expectation that you might not meet throughout the conversation, and you didn't need to, right? Because you're pitching a vision, you're pitching a story, all that sort of jazz. Third, and this is like, kind of depends on, you're not usually going to be on a stage like this and having this dynamic, but it crowds the room. I think one-to-one conversations tend to be more honest because no one's acting, right? No one's attempting to like put on a show. When there's two people, you're kind of a little bit more as the investor, like they're being judged by two people. Two people's emotions are at play. Two people you want to make happy versus, hey, there's one person, I'm just going to have a little bit more of a direct conversation. That's my recommendation overall. And again, agnostic to you two, it's my universal. As you know, it's even in the form, you must have filled it out. We say two people can be on stage, but we only recommend one. So
yeah. I think your job as a CEO is to raise money. And I think you should be the one leading the conversations. The due diligence will come and like people will talk to the rest of the team. Let that happen in the second or third or fourth conversation. But this is your job and you're more than capable to do this yourself. And I think you got to own that conversation, own that piece, because that is at the end of the day, your responsibility as a CEO to raise money and to sell the product.
Thank you.
With that, you can both get off stage. I'm just kidding. Good job. Well done.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was the last pitch of the night, by the way. So we're going to do takeaways in a couple different ways and a little bit of favorites, but reflections on that one.
I think it's a strong company. I think like as someone that has a bend towards B2B, I can relate to the problem. I understand the problem. It was communicated clearly. There was clearly expertise in what they were building, which is what I like. And I think you tend to have that from like more mature founders who have seen things, who have expertise. And to me, as someone that's always like thinking about competition and everything else, like I want to know that the team knows something that the other people don't, right? Because, you talk about UX. I think one of the counterintuitive things about like, where we're going is that, as software becomes commoditized, it'll be the user experience and that unique insight that allows you to build a product in a way that other people don't. And how do you find that as an investor in people? And I think a lot of that has to come from them understanding the industry and me being comfortable that they actually know what they're talking about in a way that other people might not. And that they have found that one kernel around which they
the
can build a
righteousness
company.
of their approach.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I think, for me, again, kind of clear problem, and all of my questions for a pitch like this would have to do with market and future of market and pricing, which, kind of shows there's a clarity of problem. There's a clarity, to your point, of credibility. And so it's a good thing when all those questions are about the future. Although I will say those are hard questions in this case. So, the follow-ups to something like this are probably much, much harder than the follow-ups to other pitches, because other pitches, you get the theme and you somewhat believe, okay, if I believe this theme, then I'm going to believe a lot of the other things this person says. In this case, because other people will compete with this team kind of directly head to head in a lot of ways, you're right. They have to really focus on their approach to convince me that they're going to be the ones versus what will inevitably be a bunch of copycats.
I generally like when a company or like a founder or founders has a very strong hypothesis.
Yeah.
Right. And I think a strong hypothesis comes based on experience and learnings and what they've been able to do in the past 12 to however many months they've been working on the product. But if I don't believe in the hypothesis, then I don't have the credibility that they're not going to waste the money that we're about to give them. Right. Which is why as I get, more mature, like I really like having teams that can come to me as like, hey, we initially started with X, we did a Y, we learned Z based on this. Now we're raising money to do A and B and C, which we think can do that. I'm like, okay, like that founder has thought through that and it allows them to have something new to move forward with that we can test and I either buy that or not.
What's being tested, how, and exactly what lesson you're attempting to learn.
Because it shows me that they can allocate time and resources and reflect on how they allocate time and resources.
Super interesting. All right, now that was all of our pitches. So we're going to do takeaways first, overall, across all of them, takeaway each. And then we're going to pick favorite concept and favorite pitch each. Okay, so my takeaway, I'll go first on overall takeaways. Thematically, I actually think this was a stronger night than it was in details. Again, I'm going to go to I love UX. I love touch and feel, and I wanted more touch and feel. And the thing that touch and feel allows in any of these products is it allows a product person, and I think a lot of investors are proxies for product people, to allow their brain to run down the future. If I can imagine, I'm going to use Invoice Ledger as a good example for this. If I can imagine, okay, I'm with you on the problem. I'm with you on, hey, we don't track these things well. There's no incentive. We want all this behavior to work better. Here's my initial product. Okay, from your initial product, which is there's a client portal, all the invoices are there. It emphasizes due dates in a way that existing products don't. It has shame as a service. That's still SaaS. Shame as a service, still SaaS. So it's SaaS. And from that, we're now building a credit score for everybody, and we're going to allow you to understand how good or bad a prospective client will be at paying an invoice. It's from the initial thing that I envisioned, which he took a while to get to, the client portal, that a bunch of other UX evolutions can be in my brain. But you got to be good at describing that initial product and then initial touch and feel.
Well, I'm going to build on that, but in a different way. What resonates with me as a pitch is being like, and I like this analogy, like when you go for a hike, you know that you're going to go hike a specific mountain, right? And I think your job as a founder is to get me excited to go on that hike with you and give me a direction of where you're going, right? But like when we get to the parking lot and we're stepping out of the car, that's like ground zero. Like we have an idea of where we want to go, but no idea how we're going to get there, right? And that to me is like why I like having that initial like personal background experience and hypothesis, because that's okay. Like, I don't know how to get to the top, but I know how to get to that first spot where we can have lunch and take that first viewpoint, right? So guide me, like hook me with that big vision of like what the summit is. And then to your point, I think where you're going is like, okay, like together, like here's how I'm thinking about getting there. I know concrete step number 1 and number 2, and then here's how I think we'll be able to get there at each stage of the company, right? So for me, I think that's why that story is so important.
And it might not be the correct map eventually.
Correct, but just the fact that you can think through it and you can demonstrate it and you can repeat. You can tell it to me in such a way that I can repeat it back to my.
Here's exactly
GP,
how
like,
he or she is going to try this thing.
Correct, right? Because I think especially for people. That pitch like analysts, associates, and principals, we're playing a game of telephone. If your story is too complicated for me to repeat to my superiors, it's not going to go well.
This is why I tell people it's very different with smaller firms, but to not talk to associates at bigger firms, because the game of telephone is just, so when we raised our Series A, it's funny, every associate who had kept up with me after our seed failed to get me a meeting with their partner. It's kind of like, you've known me, you've checked up with me, but we're tech-enabled service. So now I'm raising the A and I'm telling you the story, and you are clearly playing a game of telephone poorly. You are not a good enough storyteller on my story. And
it's really hard.
And
I think difficult. That's the thing that like founders might not understand is sometimes not you, it's not how you tell the story, is how we are able to communicate internally, right? Which to me is like the simpler, the better, but it takes a long time to get to simplicity. So again, when you guys hosted for that panel, when we talked about, fundraising as an immigrant or FirstGen founder, like one of the things that one of the speakers, Julia from Vessi Ventures, said is all about storytelling. And like, you need to start writing like a page, like an essay, paragraph, and just keep simplifying until you can get to a point where you can tell it to like a junior VC and they can't mess it up, right? Because it's so simple.
Right. It's almost as good as it is. It's never going to be as good as when you tell it, but almost. All right, now we have to pick our favorite pitch, the story that we heard, and then the concept.
The last pitch, I think, was the most clear.
Agreed. I think ClearOps, very, very vivid. Again, a lot of questions that would come after that. But when you talk about pain point, everyone can believe the pain point. The next steps seem kind of very vivid as well.
But it's about, I think this whole thing is like, we're not writing checks. We're just trying to get to the first meeting, right?
Yes.
And I think that was a very good example.
Yeah.
It was personal, it was professional, there was a clear problem, there was a hook. So I think ClearOps did a great job.
Congratulations, ClearOps.
Yeah. I actually think like the one that I thought has like the most potential to evolve into a good pitch was Dexigo.
The sales enablement AI.
Yeah.
Well done. Just like from a pure ingredient standpoint.
Yeah. The ingredients were very organic.
For me, and it's funny because I think I said, and I still agree with this, like I think there's huge platform risk, but it's what's up. Long term, again, the platform thing there weirds me out, but apparently not enough to get me discouraged because, again, the pain point is so real.
Yeah.
And from a, kind of the business model behind EV chargers is so interesting that it feels, at least in today's version of that world, there needs to be a lot of solutioning for those individuals. And so my head goes, will the manufacturers of these EV charging stations handle that, or will a third party do it? Yeah, sure, that's a huge and hard problem, but I believe in the problem itself.
Yeah.
Round of applause to WhatsApp. What's up? WhatsApp too. What's up?
And just like a round of applause to every founder.
All these founders.
Pitching is really fucking hard.
Well done. Well done.
Well done, everyone.
And to Matt for his incredible feedback and insights.
Thank you.
We do this every Monday, so the only thing I have left to say is see everybody next week. Bye.
Bye, everyone.